I am honored to be able to do the introduction for Professor AllanFels. One of the very rewarding parts of the last couple of years working with ITR has been that we've truly been able to become an international association. We are very pleased at the relationship that we now have with a number of regulators and the industry on the continent of Australia. And in fact, just in absolute numbers, I think we have almost 100% of the regulators in Australia that are now affiliated with IATR, and we've been pleased to be able to attract delegations like the State of Victoria Taxi Industry Inquiry to use the IATR conference as their best practices research, timing, and location. And since that time, other regulators have also found this opportunity and this forum to be the most cost-effective way for them to connect with other regulators, share experiences, share research, and develop on their work. Professor AllanFels is one of the most distinguished individuals to take on a review of taxi regulation, and it speaks volumes of what a jurisdiction is trying to do when they appoint someone of the caliber of Professor Fels with the ANZOG Institute, the Australia and New Zealand institution, and a former competition commissioner for Australia, and he brings those years of experience to the review. We were able to hear from him for the first time last year in Toronto, and he's here today now to help update us on the latest with the Taxi Industry Inquiry. Professor Fels.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here, and I'd particularly like to congratulate Karen and Matt and all of you on having built up IATR to be such a valuable forum and organisation. It enables you all to come together, all of us to come together and to talk about best practice and to learn from one another and to get to know one another. And last year, when I and some of our team came here, we learned a great deal from talking to you here, from establishing contact with a number of you, and also with the various international people here from the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, Singapore, as well as Australia, and so on. So we've found it to be a very good forum, and also very good research led by Dr. James Cooper and his colleagues. And I think that also pleased to be invited back to speak a second time. It's sometimes you wonder why you're asked back a second time. It's a bit like sometimes the second edition of a book. You get a chance to correct all the mistakes you made in the first one, and then to make some fresh mistakes in the second edition. So I'm going to give you a second talk, but just looking back, actually, I realise that in what I'm going to say today, I take for granted a whole lot of things about how the industry actually works in Melbourne, and you may not quite be familiar with the way the system works. I kind of explained it last time, but I'd be happy to answer any questions from you anyway. So let me talk about this inquiry that we have done, been going for about 18 months, and it was instituted by the Victorian government, and they wanted major and enduring improvements to service safety and competition in Victoria's taxi and hire car industry. And in announcing the inquiry, they expressed deep dissatisfaction with the fact that there seem to be quite low levels of public confidence, that the industry structure and regulation has failed passengers and the industry itself, and that significant reform is needed. And they also asked me, as an ex-antitrust person, to conduct the inquiry. So we have done fairly big piece of work. We've issued 9 publications, including a draft report of about 550 pages. Had 380 plus submissions. We had many forums. Many stakeholders have become involved. We've consulted everyone in the industry, regulators around the world, state and national associations. There have been active social media platforms, specialised research, and quite a bit of industry data analysis. So let me just mention some of the themes that came through to us when we talked in the early days about what we should be doing in the draft report. And I should just mention today that we issued the draft report about 3 or 4 months ago. We have since sent in a final report to the government. The final report is the property of the government, as it were. It will publish it. It has to publish it by December 12. But I'm just going to talk about the draft report, and it will be up to the government when the final report's released. Now, what we did find was that there does seem to be significant customer dissatisfaction. That is a bit of a talking point in Victoria. If you visit it, you will find that people do have quite high concerns about the industry. There's a belief also around that the regulation's been too inflexible and has stifled innovation and competition. Surveys show that people think fares are too high. When you pay with a credit card, there's a 10% surcharge. People think that's a rip-off. The vehicles are not of very good quality, and safety, especially late at night, is a major concern, both for drivers and for passengers. And a lot of views came through about a somewhat complex and confusing industry, not very transparent how it worked, and also passive investors seem to play a role, a negative role, in that they're not very much involved in service delivery. They own licences, but they don't drive or even operate cars in 70% of instances. The networks were seen as not being competitive. Booking processes and outcomes a problem. Secondary networks that offered a more personalised service were better. Driver conditions and pay were poor, quality of drivers low, improvements to training needed. There was a good deal of industry dissatisfaction with the regulators' performance. It was said there was a lack of transparency in decisions and confusion about its role. And we also heard a great deal from the disability sector, who were very concerned about the value of the industry to them. Now, we issued a draft report called Customers First. Customers First. Service, safety, choice. And that's the underlying philosophy of the report. The customer comes first. That the industry is stagnating to a degree. The number of trips seems to be fairly stagnant despite a growing population and rising income per head. Some lack of public confidence in the industry. And a basic theme of ours is that you need an overhaul from top to bottom, root and branch reform of the system of regulation. And this would help restore confidence and boost demand. So again, let me harp just a little on the problems, because when we wrote our report, spelt them out. There has been a great deal of consumer research about public and customer attitudes. There's a survey done every quarter, I think of about 1,500 people, and the level, it takes, I think, about 15 minutes of interview with each person, but the level of dissatisfaction runs at about 45%, which we think is a very high level of dissatisfaction for an industry. I'm used to thinking of 2% or something. Most industries get pretty worried. We found that indeed the drivers do lack skills and experience. They are not customer friendly in the way that if you walk into a business or something, the people tend to be fairly customer friendly. Shortage of taxis at peak times. Network services are poor. For example, if you call a network for a booking and the taxi doesn't arrive, they have no responsibility for that. Or if the quality of service is poor, they have no responsibility for that. And they don't tell you when the taxi is likely to come. And we also felt that networks had little incentive to provide good service. They make their income from operators of taxis paying fees of about $7,000 Australian per year. $1 Australian is about $1 American dollar. So that's where they get their income. Also, there's a divorce between owning licenses or medallions or whatever you call it and actually driving. 70% of people who hold a license don't actually operate or drive cars. And that means they don't really have an interest in service quality. We had a lot of complaints from the disability sector in particular about the service there, as well as delays in service. There were surveys showing people perceive the fares as too high. In country areas outside the big metropolitan city of Melbourne, which is about 4 million people, the licensing restrictions were associated with a lack of availability of taxi services. And they're important in country areas because public transport is much less available. There are a lot of old people who really need taxis. I mentioned to you that in Melbourne, and it is the same in the rest of Australia, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, etc., that a big problem is the perceived quality of the service. In rural areas, that's not the case. The drivers are seen as okay, but it's the lack of availability is the big issue there. And digging more basically, it's not a industry characterised by a lot of competition, and it is characterised by somewhat misdirected, at times excessive regulation, and as I've said, stagnating demand. So one of the key problems that we identified was the effects of the restriction on the number of licences. Obviously, some of the standard effects that apply in any sector of the economy when you restrict supply by government decision seem to apply in this sector. First of all, obviously there are fewer taxis than otherwise. There is reduced availability of taxis as a result. Also, as a result of the restrictions, the market price of licences, because they can be assigned, the market price has risen to $500,000 in Melbourne, and it's a similar number in most of the rest of Australia. And now, that being the case, the licence owners want their money back. So the high price of licences ultimately finds its way into the cost formula which is used by the regulator to set prices. It is done through the assignment cost, so let me just mention that. As I've said to you, 70, maybe more % of licence holders don't operate or drive a car at all. They assign the car to someone at about $30,000 a year. And it's that assignment price that goes into the pricing formula. And then that puts when that goes up, costs go up, then the regulator puts prices up. That leads to a rise in the value of licenses, leads to a rise in the cost of assignments, and you get into a bit of a cycle. And in addition, it's been a great field for investment. The market's been going up at about 16% a year for a long time. That's a wonderful rate of return. Hardly blinked during the global financial crisis when the rest of us were losing 30, 40, 50%. And there's been a bit of a speculative element in the value of licenses. And that has, as I've said, contributed to high fares. But another point is that there's not much money left over to pay drivers. After the licenses, or if you like, the assignment prices have been covered, after the networks have been paid, after maybe the brokers in charge of these licenses have been paid and a few other things, there just is not much left over for drivers. Drivers are the low man on the totem pole, and they get squeezed and they get very low income. And so we thought that this industry needed a bit of reform, but we're conscious of some constraints on it. First of all, that it was pretty clear from the Victorian government that they had no interest in a compensation scheme. That is, the cost of compensation, if it was justified, would have been 1.8 billion. That's a lot of money. And also, our state governments, maybe the same as in the US, I think at the moment, it's really, really tight, the money. Now, another aspect is that if you were writing a history of taxi industry regulation in Australia, if you are wanting to tell the real truth is that taxi industry regulatory policy has been subject to the constraint that no reform can occur if it would in any way harm licence values. And so that's been the whole basis for policy and for reform, and for the rejection of previous reports on reform. Another constraint is the need for fare restraint. There is strong evidence that higher fares cause fewer customers. We did get done a very extensive and thorough study of demand, and it reached the conclusion that prices are at the point where a further rise in price, say of 10%, would cause a 10% fall in the number of customers. And by the way, that corresponds to first-year economics about what a monopolist will do when its pricing will put up its prices to the point where it starts to be counterproductive. But anyway, there's quite strong evidence which you can be able to see in the report. And so our report has been fare neutral. Another constraint on reform is that the industry has been very good over the years in blocking any major reforms, both here and in most other countries. The report has 145 recommendations in 3 areas: to increase and to improve supply, to restore trust and confidence, to boost demand and to expand industry. So let me talk about them. To increase and improve supply, more taxis. So in some ways the most controversial one of the recommendations, although I'm sure they would be all of interest to you because they cover the whole field, is that we propose that in future any qualified person can buy a 5-year licence for $20,000 a year in Melbourne, similarly, and a little bit different in country, but same idea. And above all, there should be no restriction on the number of licences. But note, this is not quite the same as a full deregulation or free entry model. Under the textbook free entry or full deregulation model, what happens is that anyone who's qualified can get a licence and drive, and they may pay a few $100 administrative cost. But it's basically open entry. We have not proposed open entry, but we have said there should be no quantitative restriction on the number of licences. Anyone can get a licence, but they must pay $20,000 per year to get a licence. And that proposal is statewide, slightly lower price in country areas. We believe this will lead to more taxis, more entry, more owner drivers, cheaper assignments. Obviously, at the moment, you have to pay $30 or so for an assignment. That will obviously fall to $20, since your alternative is to go and get a licence from the government. And it will make more room for higher driver remuneration. Now, there will still be a fall in the value of licences or medallions. Present value, 500K. Actually, it's maybe 475K. We estimate 250 to 330,000 value. So under this reform, licence holders do not lose total value. It doesn't fall from $500,000 to nothing. It does fall quite substantially. But on the other hand, the licence is still of considerable value. They can earn, if they want to assign it, $20,000 a year. And if they want to sell it, then there'll be a lot of people out there very happy to buy a piece of paper which says you can earn $20,000 a year, not only for the rest of your life, but for eternity. So we see the package as balancing the conflict of interest between licence holders and the public's need for more and better quality services. We've also proposed more hire cars, drop the current licence price of $60,000. You'd pay $60,000 once, you got a hire car, to $40,000. It has to be a luxury car, technically. We would replace that with a new vehicle standard, not quite as onerous. Note that hire cars can only do pre-booked work. They can't do rank and hail. We also propose measures to facilitate more network competition, reduce entry requirements for networks, minimum fleet size, alternative booking methods, also enable secondary networks to operate independently, and also taxi operators not required to belong to a network, subject to safety and GPS tracking. The law requires all taxi operators to belong to a network, ostensibly for safety. It's said to be safer to belong to a network. We are sceptical of that. We think there are many other ways in which their safety could be protected, and as long as they are, they needn't be engaged in that anti-competitive arrangement of being required to belong to a network. Well, I'll just say briefly on FPOS that the 10% that I mentioned should be cut to 5%. Now, the second area is to restore trust and confidence. As I've said, driver quality is a major issue. They have poor knowledge and driving skills, not all of them, but a disturbingly high proportion of drivers have poor knowledge and driving skills, not customer friendly, poor motivation, low income, $13 an hour, very high turnover, and little industry revenue is actually directed to drivers. The licensing reform I mentioned will encourage owner drivers, but more needs to be done to improve driver quality. So they must have a Victorian licence for 12 months, not 3 months. The examining of them has to be done independently, not by networks, with a better knowledge of Melbourne. There needs to be a new driver agreement with fairer conditions. At the moment they have more or less no rights, occupational health and safety, insurance protection, unpaid leave, etc., because they're on so-called bailment arrangements, and the share of fares should be increased from 50 to 60%. We also believe that the industry needs to be more responsible, and service responsibility should be placed on the networks. Now, what we have proposed, I haven't kept up to date with US or North American or other law, but in most countries there is a general proviso in consumer law that there are warranties or guarantees of service, and they override any lesser warranties or guarantees that a supplier may offer. We believe they should apply to taxi networks when bookings are made with them, and that would make them legally enforceable. Independent operators subject to direct oversight by the regulator, public register of industry participants like in NYC, network performance results published, industry to introduce a better complaint system, better service for people with disabilities, for example, a central booking service for wheelchair taxis, to cut waiting times, also to discourage how many wheelchair taxis from doing other work through booking service reforms and making airport services less profitable. Most of them are out at the airport, not serving people with a disability. Talking taxi meters, I think we might have picked up that idea here. Better disability awareness training for drivers, and so on. Improve safety, use of technology to verify service providers, more late night transport operations, more and better safe ranks, mandatory use of child restraints, more robust cost benefit assessment of safety initiatives, and especially try to move to purpose-built taxis. Purpose-built taxis usually have much better safety requirements than do others, and we have noted a number of restrictions under design rules and import laws that stop the import of certain sorts of design-built taxis. For example, London taxi cabs, at the moment, they can't be brought in under the disability law. There's a restriction which indirectly has that effect. A better regulator, risk-based regulation, rearrangement of the regulation in a way we've set out in some detail, politicians out of fee setting, a better informed and outcomes-focused future regulator. Finally, we said boost demand and expand the industry. We think the industry has vast, untapped potential. It can do a lot more. Fill gaps in public transport, more use late at night and in daytime through restructured fares, allow taxis to do fixed route and shared ride work, allow them to compete for bus and community transport work, extend the multi-purpose taxi program, that's a subsidy thing for people with a disability, build more trust and better drivers. That will increase consumer confidence and boost demand. And we generally believe that more competition expands the market and generates a lot more innovation. I could give you a million examples. Telecommunications is not a bad one. People cried doom and gloom when it was liberalised, and in fact it led to a vast expansion of the market. Fares, I've already, now instead of having a set fare, it becomes a maximum fare. Discounting's possible. In regional country zones, we would remove any restrictions on fares except a few obvious things to prevent abuses. You have to notify the regulator in advance of your fares. You have to charge on the meter and certain other safeguards. Fares up on Friday and Saturday nights, but reduce the rest of the week. Short fares up, long fares down, flat fees for shared rides. So the aim of the package is to reset the industry to a more viable and competitive future. And we say that if something is not done now, there'll be further deterioration in taxi services. Reforms must address the core problems. Stakeholder impacts must be balanced during transition. Reform will take time, but there are benefits to customers that can be realised early: more service, more choice. Taxis, hire cars, new networks, shared rides with flat fees, a more accountable industry, a more responsive regulator. The public and stakeholder response to the draft report is overwhelmingly positive. Very strong support from business, tourism, economic community, disability groups, media and public commentators. I've not had quite such a kind of standing ovation from all parts of the industry when it's been presented to them. There is quite strong driver support for the reforms. The operators have a more mixed attitude. The licence holders are against it. The associations are in favour of quite a few of the recommendations, but oppose the key recommendations. I characterise their response as reform light and attempting to maintain the current protections. And in country, they say we haven't taken account of their special circumstances. We say they do. So the final report has been handed over to the government. It'll be public, I think, on the 12th of December. Government said it will consider the recommendations before providing a response in late 2012. Taxi Services Commission will be the new Victorian taxi and hire car regulator. Matt said I had to answer a question. Will it happen? I've been in 50, 60, 70 issues of this sort, whether pharmacies, news agents, television, broadcasting, agriculture, etc. I think the reform will go through, but we'll see. Any questions?
Professor Fels, I know since we have a number of people undertaking their own reforms, I know we're going to have questions. I'm going to start with Dr. Hara.
I'd like to confirm one understanding of one of your particular bold initiatives, I would say, and perhaps get you to expand on what benefits you expect from it. You're removing the limits to the number of taxis.
Correct.
That's a very traditional approach. The traditional argument in favor of that is to avoid excess entry during economic downturns. You've got this 5-year, $20,000, $100,000 commitment. I'm assuming that's what your substitute barrier is. It sounds significant. But aside from a change in style of limit, what benefit do you expect?
Okay, now this brings out quite a good point. Some people argue, as you say, that there would be excessive entry into the industry if anyone could get in at virtually zero price. Now, I personally don't particularly subscribe to that view, but I do say that if someone takes that view, we have a very full answer. It will cost $20,000 a year to enter the industry. And I believe that will curb any tendency to excessive entry. After all, entering the industry, you have to pay $20,000 a year. You will have to pay for a car and all the things that go with it. So for those in the school that are concerned about excessive entry, we have a response. The main reason, however, for the 20 is that we believe that we should take some account of the interests of people who have purchased licenses. Most of them haven't purchased them for $500,000. A few have. Many of them purchased them for 10 or 20 or 40, 70, 80, 100,000, and the values have just taken off like that over the years to the detriment of the public. Now, having skillfully avoided your real question, which is what are the benefits, we believe that there will be that and 140 other recommendations, because everyone wants to talk about licensing, and I understand that. We have called for a very dramatic shake-up with our recommendations. They go in a lot more detail than I've gone into today, things about quality of drivers, quality of service, quality of cars, a more competitive industry, a more competitive structure, and so on. And the benefits of that over the medium term to customers will be very great. Better service, a higher quality industry, greater choice. And we believe there will be better safety outcomes also.
Yes. First, a question on the $20,000 per year for the 5-year term. Is that really $100,000, or just that the term is 5 years, and if after year 1 I choose not to renew, I just amount to $20,000?
Yeah, sorry. As soon as you asked the question, I realised I could have made it clearer. It's an annual fee of $20,000. In year 1, you pay $20,000. If you drop out within year 1, you don't get anything back. Right. Year 2, you pay $20,000, etc. And then year 5, you can reapply for your licence and you'll pay $20,000, etc. indefinitely.
Okay, so first of all, I think this is a very clever and insightful way of creating barriers to entry, which has always been the problem of the open entry system in the taxi cab industry. I mean, that's what, so you've created a barrier. Now, my second question is, there is a market out there today for licenses, which you indicate has escalated in speculation and all that. But now you set a floor underneath that of 20,000, which in fact, you know, the real market clearing price may be less than 20,000 a year in terms of the capitalization of that. Does that concern you at all?
I'm sort of fully aware of your point, and my belief is that the price will easily settle at 20, because at the moment people are happy to pay 30 plus for it. So if they're ready to pay 30 plus at the moment, I don't see it as falling below 20 in the marketplace.
Right,
but
now
there's no law that stops the private market falling below it. And indeed, the industry has hired 5,632 public relations people who are spending all their time telling the public that the value of licenses will fall to nothing. So all I have to say is, if there is a worldwide collapse, if we run out of fuel, if there is economic disaster galore and we all have to drive bicycles, then the value could fall below 20. But there are no signs on the horizon whatsoever that it will fall below 20.
Right. And again, you've basically set the floor at that level, so it should stay at 20.
Well, it's a floor, but it's not stopping a person, selling below that price, but it won't happen.
Right.
So, however you want to put it.
Can I just ask you, you've got a fantastic way of making money. Are you ring-fencing this money as a proposal to put it back into the industry?
Yes. It's not such a fantastic way of making money. We will cost out the thing in the report, and you'll see on any plausible. See, there's not going to be a flood of new entrants at 20,000 a year. So, in the report, we've done some modelling, and we come out at about 500 entry. There are 5,000 licences, maybe 500 entry, those sort of numbers. So if you multiply 500 by 20,000, it's not a huge amount of money, but we do say it should be put into the industry. Now, the good point that you're raising, this is for those of us who are used to dealing with the finance departments, they do not support ever hypothecation. You raise money on a tax on someone, and then you want to hypothecate it to someone, it's against the rules. But we have gone for hypothecation. It's added to my vocabulary, by the way.
Hi, I was just wondering, is there a formula for the assignment floor, price floor that you assign, or will it gradually be eroded by inflation, sort of leading to a more progressively open industry over time?
The report says it should be not indexed, it should be fixed. That's the draft report, by the way. At all times, by the way, I'm talking about the draft report.
One last question.
As you like, I've got a few more minutes. Yep.
I may have missed it in the slides, but I believe I heard it in an answer to an earlier question. Apparently, your scheme will permit transfer of licenses?
Yes.
Why?
Sorry. The old licenses can be transferred, not the new ones.
So,
Dr. Cousins is going to be on the panel this afternoon. He can go into some of this. I've got that right, have I not, David? Yep. The new ones can't be transferred.
I can buy an option for 5 years, $20K a year, and if I want to exercise the option further, I can request.
Yeah.
Does the issuing authority have the right to deny my request?
Not really, no.
Even
we've just
for reason?
As soon as I hear your question in an earlier one, I realise we may not have explained it very well. It's 20,000 a year for a licence. Somehow or other we presented it as 5,000, as 5 years, maybe there's a review or something. But most people would be utterly confident it would be renewed.
I guess one of the things, we love real-world examples and research, so we'll be watching this to see if your prognostications really come out. Based on past studies in past cities, you might want to look at the difference in the markets that are being served and where this new supply really goes. I can't see it going to the call market, but the hail market will probably get the bulk of these new suppliers. But it'll be interesting to see if you literally do have that effect. But I guess my one word of maybe caution
why
is...
do you say that, by the way? Why do you say
my one
that?
word is caution. Well, because I don't think the demand for the call business will really change all that much. And I think in cities where we have had an influx of additional supply, in many cases would argue an oversupply, those drivers gravitated to the markets which were the airport, the downtown, and didn't want to get outside of that market sphere to go to
suburban areas. So that service actually decreased as
Yeah.
a result of more supply. But let me suggest one last thing, and I'll sit down. You know, you may want to try a little bit of experimentation instead of doing this all at once throughout the entire region. You're going to affect a lot of value of the current medallion holders. And here in the States, it's state by state, but we have such thing as taking a value. And the state supposedly has a hard time taking something of value that has been let out as a particular right of the private traded owner. And apparently that's not the case in Australia.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, on your first point, I'm not that sure that the coal market won't expand if some of the restrictions on competition are lifted and there's a bit more network competition. But above all, we are removing the maximum price. So if demand is not growing for coal, just rank and hail, then that sector will probably do something about its prices to stimulate demand. So I think it will, as you say, be interesting to have a look at that. Now, on this value thing, of course, in the Australian Constitution, there are provisions, we copied them from the US about appropriation of people's property. But I better be honest and admit they don't apply to the states, they only apply nationally. So there will be no successful, there'll be legal challenges probably, but they'll be unsuccessful in my view. But what we're not removing someone's property. We are just recommending some changes in policy that happen to affect the value of some property rights. Now that happens every day of the week, all over the country, all over the US, all over the world. Governments are doing things, changing policies, which cause rises and falls in the value of licences, rises and falls in the value of your home. You know, they change the interest rate policy tomorrow, your home value is deeply affected. The value of your car is affected when there's a tax. Yeah. So all we're doing is just making some policy changes. We're not taking anyone's property off them, but their value will be affected. So, you know, there's heaps of legal advice, and it's obvious anyway. This is not property confiscation, it's just a policy change affecting the value of a licence. I see no legal problem. I see very little problem of principle. Of course, we've been debating this up and down the country about it. But what's actually happened is that the policy for the last 30 years has been to do everything to affect the property value of consumers. They have to pay through the nose for every measure that makes licences more valuable. It's just being reversed at the moment.
Professor Fels, thank you. We have a little token of our appreciation. We have some clean taxi cufflinks. So, Karen, you want to join us?